Our recording. Great. Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Welcome to our Exchange Journalism Exchange. This is the last one we're doing before our AJMC pre-conference that's coming up. I'm Andrea Wenzel. I'm an assistant professor at Temple University and co-founder of the Germantown Info Hub. And I'm here with two awesome co-organizers today. If you want to introduce yourselves, Jake and Latrell.
Sure. I'm Jake Nelson. I'm an assistant professor at Arizona State. And I've been doing this with Andrea for, I guess, a few months now. And as she mentioned, we have another one of these coming up in August. And I will send a link out to the chat so that you can look it up and RSVP for it if you're interested.
Latrell?
Yes. And thank you for coming out this afternoon. My name is Latrell Crittenden. I am assistant professor and program director of communication at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. And I'm also one of the, I also work with Andrea on the Germantown Info Hub.
And Latrell will also be part of the AJMC pre-conference. We'll share more about that at the end, a little bit more. But today we want to really focus in on an issue that's sort of at the core of journalism and that has been very much part of a conversation recently. And that's, how has this concept of objectivity been interpreted in journalism, and particularly when people are looking at how the sort of dominant interpretation of it has been used to reinforce structural racism and whiteness in the field. This is obviously not a new conversation, and many of you have been very active in this conversation for some time, for years, but it's something that with the recent uprisings has been a more urgent conversation that has sort of crossed into mainstream dialogue around journalism. So we're going to have some time today to have a hopefully robust discussion with all of you. We're going to aim to have some breakout groups. We'll see how it goes. If it gets a little bit, the time goes wonky, then we may adjust that. But our hope is to have opportunities for you to have small group conversations. But first, we want to hear from some presenters who've each been thinking about these issues deeply for some time. And we're going to hear from Tahit Chappelle, is the project manager for Free Press News Voices and the executive board member of Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. We're going to hear from Candis Callison and Mary Lynn Young. They're both associate professors at University of British Columbia and authors of a really great book called Reckoning: Journalism's Limits and Possibilities. But first, we're going to kick it off with Kat Stafford. She's the national race and ethnicity writer for the Associated Press. And Kat, if you can join us and share a bit about how you're thinking about the concept of objectivity in your work, and particularly in this current moment.
Yeah, so thanks for having me, first of all. I really appreciate being able to participate in this discussion, which I think is paramount right now. So for me, just a little bit of background, I'm from Detroit, a city that has gone through seismic change over the years, poverty, disruption in terms of jobs, loss of auto, plants, just a lot of change. And then COVID-19 hit. And it was just, I've been calling it kind of like a pressure cooker moment, where it was just like years and years of decades of disinvestment that all came to a head at once. And I think what we're seeing across the nation right now is this national reckoning around race that, to be frank, was really 400 years in the making when you think about the oppression and the systemic racism that African Americans and other people of color have faced along the way in the creation of this country. And so when I think about the reckoning around objectivity and journalism and everything that's happening in our own industry, for me personally, it's much more than that, because right now we're also seeing an unprecedented amount of Black journalists and other journalists speaking out about the issues that they've dealt with in a newsroom. So while it's nice to see publications make a move to capitalize the being Black, a lot of it is performative if we are unwilling to really deal with the issues that are within our own newsrooms. And I can't think of a more ironic thing than to know that we are being forced to cover race and racism and police brutality in ways that never before, when many journalists of color have been pushing for newsrooms to cover these issues. They have been pushing for our newsrooms to, deeply embed ourselves in communities of color. But what's really ironic is we're covering this, but we're still unwilling, I feel like, to really talk about the issues within our own industry. So I think the conversation about objectivity is important, but until newsrooms start to really not just hire journalists of color, but to make plans to retain journalists of color and to create clear pathways to promote and help their careers flourish, the conversation is pointless. Those are my opening thoughts. I know that's kind of grim, but I just think that we are in a place where we need to be frank about the status of this industry and just think about how many journalists of color along the way have been forced out of positions. They have left the industry entirely because of the environments, the toxic environments that they have had to deal with in this industry. So those are my thoughts. Again, thank you so much for inviting me to participate.
Thank you, Kat. That's helpful grounding thoughts to sort of start off with. I want us to hear from Candis and Mary Lynn. I think, Candis, you're going to represent for the two of you about your book, Reckoning, which, again, I highly recommend. I'll just let you go ahead and take it away. And I think you're going to share your screen. So
yeah, let me just try to share that. All right. Are you seeing
yes.
the slides?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. You're not seeing the timer, are you?
No.
Okay, cool. So let me just start out by acknowledging that I'm talking to you from Musqueam lands in Vancouver. This is an Indigenous people. Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh are the Indigenous people in the Vancouver area. And I am from the Tahltan Nation, which is in northwestern British Columbia. We're a Dene-speaking people, so related to Dene-speaking people throughout the Americas. And I'm speaking on behalf of my co-author, Mary Lynn Young. We just had this book come out, and it's been really interesting to see how often the word reckoning shows up in tweets, in articles, in op-eds, and it feels like a really powerful moment. Our book really comes out of both our experience as journalists formerly and as journalism professors. We saw how few of the critiques that have been taken up both in the scholarship and in the practice of journalism. And we saw, the harm that was still ongoing and has been for a very long time when it comes to issues related to race, gender, indigeneity, intersectional concerns, settler colonialism. And, as Kat mentioned, how white newsrooms continue to be, right? So how predominantly white they are, both in the US and Canada, and it's even more pronounced in Canada because we have a very large Indigenous population here. And really where we're coming from is that objectivity is not good enough. Audiences have been saying that for some time. Social platforms have told us that in spades, but we've also seen how multiple journalisms have begun to flourish with digital platforms. In part, we're really inspired by the multiple journalisms that are flourishing. This is a quote from Rick Harp, who produces a podcast that I contribute to. And he pointed out when he came to a conference for Indigenous scholars and journalists that I held at Princeton when I was there for visiting professorship last year, that for Indigenous people, stories literally can be life or death, and that the status quo is literally deadening and destroying the lives of Indigenous people. And so part of what our book does is really ask how it is that journalism is inquiring and how it's contributing to social orders and propping up social orders in some ways. So we ask these sort of central questions about how journalists know what they know, who gets to decide what good journalism is, and what sort of experts journalists are, and what role they play in society. So the book makes 5 main points, and I'm doing the lightning round here. So basically, journalism has talked a lot about being in crisis due to technology and economic foundations crumbling. That's resting mostly on an uncritical view that journalism contributes to making the world better over time. And we're saying that that is a flawed story because it prevents us from reckoning with historic and ongoing harms, from recognizing how journalism has been part of settler colonialism and actively propped it up, for example. You know, and we draw from scholars who have pointed out how much journalism has contributed to, you know, a certain kind of hierarchy when it comes to racial issues, when it comes to gender issues. You know, a defense of journalism then needs to acknowledge that complicated history. And that's not saying that journalism hasn't done some good work, but recognizing that journalism is actively evolving, and in part that's due to, you know, this sort of pushback that audiences have been, you know, doing increasingly vociferously on social media platforms. And so we conclude that journalists need to employ what we term a systems journalism. So not just focusing on events, but looking at how events reveal social systems and structures and the deep histories. You know, Kat referred to this as 400 years in the making, right? So Indigenous people have been talking about how colonialism sort of has underpinned so much of the way that media have reported on issues related to Indigenous people. You know, so, in Canada, we also talk a lot about how Black and Indigenous scholars are essential to thinking about how journalists should be covering issues related to our communities and to other communities of color. And we think this also really relates to big issues like COVID and like climate change, for example. Because the question that we ask, and if you read our op-ed, we ask this really centrally, is how do we want to live together? An Indigenous journalist, Tanya Talaga, has written a couple of really important books that talk about how we find paths forward from and with knowledge about our histories of relations. The book itself really tangles at first with scholarship, and then looks at what audiences are doing, and then really looks at the way journalists have been asking questions in their memoirs, in, you know, the quit lit, so literature, you know, the blogs, the tweets that come out when people quit organizations. And I think that if you know, if we were writing this book right now, we'd have like an enormous amount of op-eds and tweets to draw on of people really talking about how journalism, both the newsroom practices, but also you know, how, you know, their experiences in those newsrooms have really shaped and prevented them from doing the kind of work that they want to do. And so the last half of the book draws on ethnography in newsrooms and among freelance journalists, looking at how legacy media might repair, how, you know, new startups might reform practices related to journalism. And the last chapter really looks at the transformative work that Indigenous journalists are doing. And I think, you know, if you were to tell this story from other communities of color, from Black journalists, from Latinx journalists, you would have similar kinds of observations about how people who are accountable to their communities, who know from somewhere, you know, we refuse the kind of objective point of view, because everybody knows from somewhere. And in fact, that objective view has served to prop up and reinforce dominant narratives and dominant social orders, and white supremacy and white patriarchy in ways that have been observed since the 1970s. And so if you know from somewhere, then you need to start recognizing the way that systems and social structures are acting in events, in people's lives. And so that's how we arrive at this notion of systems journalism. And I put up a quote from the book. Basically, systems journalism asks what might and can we expect of the worlds we inhabit, of the intersections, interferences, interactions, resistances that are recorded, mapped, and tracked in the stories that get circulated and realities that get described. You know, we actively offer an alternative to objectivity, in that we suggest that journalists should locate themselves, right? And in so doing, then they might be able to situate where they know from and how they know. And, you know, that gets to the larger questions of what kind of experts journalists are in any given situation, and what they bring to the table when they're reporting on the story, how they think about what a story is, who the relevant experts are to interview, etc. Mary Lynn can follow up on more of the questions as we get into that. I think I made it in 5 minutes.
That was great. That was great. And I have lots of questions, but let's, if you, okay, great, perfect. So, and just to remind everybody, if you have questions, please throw them into the chat. And we'll also, you know, give you an opportunity to raise your hand and speak too, but it makes it go a little bit more smoothly. Last but not least, let's hear from Tahid. And he's been very actively looking at some very tangible ways of grappling with these things with some news organizations from his vantage point with Free Press. If you want to just go ahead and jump in and share what you've been up to.
Yeah, hi. Thank you again for inviting me for this important conversation. And it is hard to follow up with the speakers who've laid out the foundational groundwork to begin this conversation. But to echo Kat's earlier comments, that this is a conversation that, you know, it may feel doom and gloom, and it may feel depressing, but it is a reality. It is a reality that we have to acknowledge and we have to face, that the reckoning and the uprisings that we're seeing within Black journalists and journalists of color within these newsrooms has long been a movement that has followed a legacy of hundreds of years of oppression, censorship, and disenfranchisement by the media industry. And these are communities that have been talking about these issues, but just have never had the platform, the agency, or the ability to get these issues to light into the public consciousness. But now we're starting to see that at a what I hope to say is a critical mass in shifting the conversation within our industry. So some of these, with the Free Press as a project manager here in Philadelphia, which for those who are not in Philadelphia, you know, this is a 44% Black population. It's a city that suffers from a 25% poverty rate. There's a lot of issues that are impacting Black and brown communities. Free Press has organized, you know, civil rights, social justice organizations, media organizations to address some of these issues that journalists of color and Black journalists have been raising inside local newsrooms. We think that some of the suggestions, which again have been talked about for decades on decades, are easily attainable, and also provide newsrooms an opportunity to hold themselves accountable on how they want to shift the conversations, how they want to enforce policy changes and cultural changes within the newsroom to better reflect the communities that they should be serving and reporting for, and really holding themselves to a higher standard of being able to tell more stories with more context and nuances that provide some of that historical background and some of that systemic coverage that is often lacking in our current journalism. So some of the things that Free Press has been raising is really allowing newsrooms and giving newsrooms opportunities to audit their sources, to audit their diversity of their newsrooms, to just establish a baseline of saying, okay, where are we in terms of the diversity of our entire company? Who are our partners that we organize and we collaborate with? Who are the sources that our journalists interact with and center in our reporting? And what are the types of stories that we end up sharing or elevating? And who are the subscribers and our supporters and our readers that are currently supporting our business? There's a lot of conversations, especially with the ongoing turbulence of this industry. There's ongoing conversations about diversifying the readership, about diversifying our outreach, about bringing in different readers from different backgrounds and different perspectives. But it's hard to have that conversation when historically these communities, which, you know, newsrooms now need so much more support of, they haven't been included in these conversations. They haven't felt represented in the media. And so when this outreach happens to try to reach more communities of color, a lot of communities of color are saying, well, we're not reflected. You're not reflecting our values. You're not reflecting our issues. And that goes back to the conversation of, it's been historically hard for Black journalists and journalists of color to even break into newsrooms. And many have had to form their own publications without resources, without instrumental or you know, support. And so many newsrooms that have been white-centered and white majority for so many years are now starting to see that this view, which has shaped media coverage, has been harmful. And now there's an opportunity to really address and acknowledge the past mistakes and the lack of innovation and reform internally to change these cultures. And I think by being able to address the diversity issue, kind of like how Kat had recommended, where we bring in more journalists, but not just journalists of color, just at the entry level, but to really retain them and build them into managerial positions, really advance their journalism and their skill sets, and give them an opportunity to really center the communities that they come from and the perspectives that they bring to the table, rather than censoring them around the concepts of objectivity. That's a good starting point, because it's not like there's a lack of journalists of color. It's not like there's a lack of Black journalists around that are waiting to write about these issues. It's about how can we actually start making better, more concrete, more intentional outreach and bringing people from different backgrounds into our newsrooms and having them write about these stories from a different perspective.
Thank you so much. So I know there's a lot of questions. I want us to, oh, Latrell, I was gonna go to you, but Latrell had a question, but I will give him a minute because he may have a 2-year-old running around that he needs to deal with. So I'll actually, I'll hand a question that Jessica asked, which I have a related question. This is, I think, mostly for Candis and Mary Lynn. Examples of practical, concrete ways to raise these issues. And I remember you saying something about you want journalists to locate themselves. Can you give us kind of a practical, tangible way that a journalist could do that as they're reporting a story?
I mean, maybe I can start and Candis will jump in and let me know what I missed because we talked about this in advance. Basically, Candis and I met last night to kind of answer some of the prompts that we were given, and this was one of them. To acknowledge with clarity that in being a journalist, you actually are contributing to social ordering, and really try to have clarity at the beginning about what kind of social order you're trying to create and what kind of world you're trying to create through your journalism. The second point is acknowledging that doing away with the default whiteness. There should be no default, and having people speak about their subject position in a story meeting or just to sort of introduce themselves so that people can actually see that it matters and that there is no default, that everyone is speaking from somewhere. We also talked about the fact that it's not just interpersonal relations or people in an event that matter, it's also non-human relations, relations with lands and waters. I mean, these all have to be brought into what we talk about as a systems perspective for covering journalism, and obviously with climate change being a major issue, and COVID, that it's much broader than obviously just people. Reckoning that events are just part of social structures, that histories matter, and that in a lot of stories that we've been seeing recently in media, that they're actually looking at history in a much more deep and impactful way with respect to oppression. And so recognizing that events are only one lens and that the systems are really what we're trying to intervene in and transform. And that's it for me. Candis?
Yeah, add is that in arriving at locating yourself as a mode of differential sort of practice, you know, partly we're drawing on scholarship and critiques of science in particular. You know, critiques of objectivity have been going on since the 1970s. My Indigenous Roundtable fellow, Kim Tolman, is a pretty well-known scholar. She always goes into shock when we say, oh yeah, no, journalists still really go for objectivity. And she's like, what? Like, hasn't anybody read a book since the 1970s? I'm like, you know, this is really part of the practice. This is part of the challenge. And her response is, you know, everybody has mud on their feet from somewhere. Right, I think, which is a great metaphor to think with, and for us in talking to Indigenous journalists, really the ways in which they consider themselves as accountable to communities that they come from, communities that they're connected to, that they're always in relation both to the past journalisms that came before them, so they're adding to that. And also, you know, there's an obligation they have to lands and waters and non-humans, which is you know, which is an addition, I think, to really thinking about how journalism tools might be used to think about the world and also contribute to it.
A follow-up question there that comes from Nicole Blanchett. Could you give an example of how you'd acknowledge the social order within a story?
I mean, I can think of one. So, you know, in Canada, we had obviously an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. And, you know, a lot of stories are event-centered. They talk about when a woman goes missing or a woman is murdered, but actually locating that story in the history and ongoing colonialisms that are occurring in Canada, recognizing that it's not just an event, it's part of a much larger history of oppression and colonialism and ongoing colonialism going on. So that's just one example. Candis, any others?
Yeah, I mean, COVID is really interesting. I think Kat mentioned this when she was talking. This is, you know, it's essentially an infrastructure problem, right? As much as it is a public health issue. And I can think of this one journalist locally who talked about how COVID for many Indigenous communities in our region is really about food security. And so it brings into to bear a history of colonialism, you know, rural communities, as well as this, you know, ever-present kind of thing that, you know, is hanging over communities that have dealt with pandemics before, right? So there's a lot more to telling this story than merely just looking at a pandemic as a kind of one-off, when Indigenous communities have survived many pandemics.
Kat, did you want to jump in on this? I'm just wondering if when you do your own reporting, how you might be thinking about this.
Yeah, so like, especially with the COVID pandemic, one of the things that I wanted to be really intentional about was how we were covering it. Once it became apparent, once we gathered all of the data and we started to see the racial disparities, I felt like a lot of the early reporting on the pandemic really centered on how Black Americans were more likely to have these comorbidities, right? These issues that made them more likely to die or to contract COVID, but there wasn't a lot of nuanced coverage about, you know, looking at how did it get to that point, looking at these communities are more likely to have food deserts or food insecurity, as Candis referenced, or a lack of transportation, lack of healthcare, a lot of issues that when you put it all together, of course, they're going to be more likely to be hit hard by something like this. So I say all that to say, you know, when we're reporting, it's important to build relationships with the community, to not just swoop in when something like this is happening, but to already have that rapport built up so you know who the community pillars are. We were able to tell a really deep story about the impact on Detroit just because, you know, me being of that community, I could see early on, okay, everyone was being impacted. We were losing so many well-known people. And you can only tell that type of story from a newsroom that is really invested in the community. So I kind of think it ties into the conversation about objectivity. You know, for a long time, communities of color have felt ignored. And a lot of Black journalists are saying that you can attribute that, you know, to the way that historically their communities have been covered. The only time people see folks in certain Black communities is when a crime is communicated, is committed. And in fact, Latrell had came to the Detroit Free Press when I was still in the newsroom there to kind of really lay out some of the issues that were happening in Pittsburgh. And as he was talking, I was like, wow, the same thing happens here in Detroit, where journalists were only connecting with the community when it was to tell a horrible story. There were no connections made for about, you know, the quote unquote positive things that were happening, or about the community building together to, you know, make their community better. So I think when we talk about objectivity, we also need to be thinking about how can our newsroom build a better relationship with the community. I often tell reporters, sometimes just go to these communities, you know, not even if you have a story, just to sit there, get to know someone. And of course that's hard in a pandemic, but you could still make those connections via Zoom, via the phone. Just reach out and talk to someone. Our relationships with the community should not be extractive. It should be symbiotic in the sense that the community is getting something from us as we are getting their voices in our stories. We are here to serve the community. That's how I try to approach my journalism. It shouldn't be this process of just swooping in when we need something and then that's it. No, there's no follow-up. No, you need to build an actual sustainable relationship with communities.
That's a really very important point that I think probably will resonate a lot with this group, because there's a lot of people here who are very invested in the concept of engaged journalism, which is often, you know, this question of objectivity and advocacy comes up a lot in those circles. I want to, and also make one little plug for Lewis Wallace's podcast Review from Somewhere. Just did an episode on extractive journalism you might want to check out, and they have some resources on their website. So Latrell, did you want to jump in?
Yes. So, and Kat, I'm glad you brought up Pittsburgh, because Pittsburgh is back in the news with a situation that's happening at the flagship newspaper there, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, in which a young woman, an African-American journalist, has been sidelined as a result of a tweet that she had sent out that essentially was critical overall of coverage of so-called looting in by local news coverage. As a result of that, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette decided to prevent her from covering any protest stories from this point forward. And in a statement that actually released to the Pittsburgh Black Media Federation, they justified this by saying that fairness, removal of bias, removal of even the hint of conflict of interest are core principles of journalism. We are also aware that institutional racism exists and that there is a need for diversity, but you can never get to social justice without basic fairness and truth. Kat, we can start with you, but what are your, when you hear something of like that nature where a newsroom is justifying sidelining a journalist of color based on this idea of fairness and a lack and no bias, what are your thoughts on a response of that nature?
Well, I think I and many others, you know, who have been watching that situation unfold have been troubled by it, that in a moment of historic racial reckoning, that a newsroom would make a decision to sideline a Black woman who likely has perspective, who likely has that level of nuance that could bring, you know, an added benefit to the coverage. So that's the first piece of it. The second piece of it is, I'm sure, or at least I hope all of you have read Wesley Lowery's piece about objectivity. There was one line that really kind of drove it home for me, where he said, "The views and inclinations of whiteness are accepted as the objective neutral. When Black and brown reporters and editors challenge those conventions, it's not uncommon for them to be pushed out, reprimanded, or robbed of new opportunities." And I think that every journalist of color, at least the ones who I know, we all have a story where we push back. We push back on the framing. We push back on how the coverage was being planned. And we all have dealt with that, where it's like, no, you cannot be an advocate. But we're not advocating. We are trying to show the full scope. When people are arguing that objectivity, the notion of what it is and what it means, we're not saying to throw it out the window. What we're saying is that we need to examine what it means. And in its current form, is it inclusive? Does it represent all readers? Does it represent everyone in the community? And I think as it stands, when you look at how journalism has played out, when you look at how communities of color have been covered historically, it's not fair. And I think that to say that we want to re-examine it or reimagine it doesn't mean that we're all just going to be writing opinion pieces. No, it just means being intentional about who are the voices that are being censored in the story. Who are you talking to? How is the story being framed? Is it a story about police violence? Well, are you just running with whatever the police say, or are you trying to go out to the community to understand their vantage and viewpoint? So I think that that's what this conversation is really about. And sorry if I'm long-winded. It's just, I think that right now, this is a moment where I think I see so much opportunity for newsrooms to be better, to really uplift the voices of people in the newsrooms to help guide them toward the future. We talk about the business side of journalism often, but I feel like people don't realize that the two are really interconnected. So until we realize how to cover these communities better, will we ever figure out the business side? I don't think so.
Tahid, you had written something in the chat, but do you want to expand on that for the audience who may not be in chat?
Yeah, sorry. There was a question about outreach, recruitment paths, and strategies to connect and welcome journalists of color into our newsroom. I put in a bunch of organizations that have benches on benches of amazing journalists who would be great to just recruit, or not even just recruit, but just to establish relationship and understand how you or your newsrooms can do better. NABJ, AAJA, NAHJ. The new Trans Journalists Association, which came out with an amazing style guide, is a great organization to look at. The Native American Journalists Association is also a great organization. We have to elevate Indigenous communities. There's not enough coverage in that as well. So I was just dropping a couple of organizations that are great to reach out to and establish some recruitment ideas. And you know, if you're looking to hire, those are the organizations to go to as well. And you know, there's not much that I can add to Kat's points. I mean, she's on point. She's literally on point, and what she's saying is that so much of the times, especially when we're seeing around policing and violence in Black communities, it's always felt like it's been transactional, that you have local journalists still feeling like parachute journalists coming into communities only when there's drama, only when there's violence, only when there's some sort of theater that they think is capturing emotions that meets a certain threshold that's always been defined by white newsrooms. What is the threshold reached that establishes newsworthiness is established by white newsrooms. What do we determine as news is established by white newsrooms. And to consider that there's so much unconscious and conscious bias on what we determine as worthy of reporting and where we allocate our resources has always been reflective around white-centered issues. And so we need to start deconstructing how do we determine what is newsworthy and how more journalists of color can feel empowered to bring up issues from their communities, and how white editors can start listening more and acknowledging that they don't have the nuance and understanding of these issues, and that it is better overall for the newsroom and the organization to really focus on these issues as well. And really, we can't address the business side until we address the culture. We can't do that.
Thank you. There's a lot of really great things in the chat. I recommend everybody look at, and we'll also save it and send it around. Tahid has a link also to the letter that Free Press did that has some really concrete recommendations, which I think are worth chewing over. I want us to have the opportunity to have some smaller group conversations and try to get as kind of concrete as possible in them, and thinking about how you can kind of take on some of this work in your own newsrooms, if you're in a newsroom, or if you're in a journalism school, or wherever you might be, how you can think about adjusting your practices to make them more reflexive, to tackle systems journalism, however you want to kind of frame it. So we're going to break up into some small breakout groups, and I'd like if each group could have one person kind of be a report back person. We may or may not get time to do that, but you could perhaps enter some of your notes into the chat. That would be perfect. We're just going to take around 10-ish minutes to do that, and then we'll have some time at the end to kind of debrief together. Sound okay? I'm sorry that was a little shorter than we would have liked it, but we just wanted to respect everybody's time and make sure we have a second to kind of debrief here. So sorry about that. I apologize.
There's really nothing quite like the heart-pounding anxiety you get when you see the clock going down to 0 in the middle of a conversation.
Part of my problem is I need to figure out how to. Yeah, I always accidentally make it so you only have a minute left before it does that. And I know there's a way of changing the settings. Anyhow, I'm learning. So thank you for taking that on though. Did anybody want to share back something from their group? Were there some interesting ideas about how to kind of take these things and do concrete actions with them?
I'll go first. So in my group discussion, we had a conversation just around continuous engagement and relationship building. There was conversations around that, there is no excuse to start building relationships, that, long-term goals are good, but there are always easy ways to address short-term gains. In the way of partnerships, in the way of reaching out to diverse organizations and establishing communications with them to figure out how you can add their context, their background, their expertise in their communities into your journalism. There was conversation around what's it called? I'm just reading my notes here. At least allowing more journalists and editors to go and sit in on community meetings that are already being convened, not specifically for intentional of reporting on a story, but just to be a presence and saying, hey, you know, I want to know what the issues are, what this organization or these community members are talking about, and how can we kind of bring that to light, you know, when the time comes, and just being an overall better presence, and not being, and this goes back to not being transactional, just actually showing up digitally, if you can, to these organizations' meetings and establishing those relationships. And this is a continuous effort too. This isn't something that, you know, suddenly, oh, we need to do this now because everyone's asking us. It's like, no, this is part of our work. This is part of our news gathering process. This is part of our relationship building and representation in our work. We need to do this intentionally and not just when we feel like this is, you know, a benefit to our work. And so there's a lot of good conversations around that. There's good conversations around building contests and getting community members engaged and having that type of partnership and relationship as well. And then there was conversations about finding ways and figuring out ways, especially during the pandemic, to give reporters and editors more time to do these relationships buildings. You know, the news cycle is very, very demanding. We don't have a whole lot of time. Journalists don't have a whole lot of time to do this. So where can we find opportunities to really build relationships without feeling the crunch of the news cycle, without feeling pressured of a deadline? There has to be bigger conversations on allowing journalists to have that, you know, breathing space so that they can actually do community engagement in a more intentional way without feeling pressured to produce all the time, so to speak.
That's very helpful. And I think, yeah, the more we can think of those kind of concrete practice things that we can do, and thinking about time is obviously a huge, huge part of that. Anyone else want to share back from their group?
Yeah, I'll share a little bit from our group. You know, one of the things about knowing from somewhere is that you also have to recognize what you don't know. And I think this becomes really important when you're coming to a situation where you may not have the depth of knowledge and expertise. And oftentimes, I think we discussed this a little bit before we had the breakout session, oftentimes journalists of color, Indigenous journalists, they are told they're biased if they come to a story with a lot more prior information or deeper history. And I think we need to really think differently about that, to think about what journalists bring to a story as a form of expertise, right? Not, and that expertise has limitations. And so, you know, you might have real limits to your expertise if you're coming at it as a white journalist. And I think that's where the relational aspect becomes really important, but also really recognizing the limits of your own knowledge and expertise. It's, you know, especially in fast moving events when it comes to protests. We've had a lot of land-related protests in Canada. You really need to know the history of Indigenous rights in this country and the history of settler colonialism in order to report deeply on it. So.
I feel terrible, but I think we're going to have to cut it off to respect everybody's time. I just want to say that we're going to be sharing around this everything in the chat. I'll leave it open for a little bit longer if you want to add anything else in there. We'll share the video, and this is a prequel to a pre-conference, and so I invite everyone to join us on August 5th for the AJMC pre-conference that we're organizing. Jake, did you want to say something briefly about that?
Just very quickly, I just put a link into the chat for people to find more information about it. It'll be a little bit longer than this, and it'll be divided into two sections. The first will be talking about issues within news quality, and the second part of it will be issues within news economics. So it's going to be a lot of us talking about what we've been talking about in this conversation and others, but with an eye toward understanding what the best steps forward are for actually improving the quality of the news, and then also using those improvements to actually find ways to find opportunities to make the news economically viable.
And Latrell will be part of that, and we'll be talking about building relationships with communities. And also I want to give a big thanks to Latrell, who's doing some really interesting work right now on what's happening in Pittsburgh and in Pennsylvania in general. So we'll hopefully get to hear more from him then. Thank you all so much. I'm really grateful that you could all join us, and wish we had more time because we could certainly keep talking, but I'll respect that. And I'll leave this open for a couple seconds here, but thank you and have a great day. Take care.